Who is this stranger you only saw once, but still think about sometimes? Had a long conversation one afternoon in Washington Square Park with an old man who saw me looking at pigeons and started talking to me about bird behavior. We wound up talking for like 3 or 4 hours and he was pretty wise and kind of eccentric. Never mentioned any family or anything. I never saw him again. This man in a Red Sox hat that I met on a Connect flight from Pittsburgh to California. We both forgot our neck pillow and decided to go with each other to buy some because a kiosk had a buy one, get one 50% sale. He ended up paying for mine too. I think about him every time I board a flight with that neck pillow. I was a new cashier at a hardware store and this disheveled young guy came through my line buying a few cheap things like driveway markers and rope or something. Turned out he was deaf and when I tried to tell him the total he didn't hand me enough money. So I wrote it down on paper for him and he still didn't seem to be getting it. It was busy and we obviously had a communication issue and the people in line behind him were starting to get antsy annoyed. He had me remove a few items but still didn't have enough. Eventually he flipped over the paper I'd written numerous totals on and wrote simply "I'm sorry" and left with nothing. I still feel terrible about it and sometimes wonder if he's doing okay. So I was waiting in a line of traffic with my father for an air show. I was so excited that I had been smiling at and waving to random strangers for most of the drive. In the middle of a halted intersection, I saw a bearded man walking down the side of the road. I smiled and waved at him. He smiled and waved back. I'll never forget that delightful man. I never even saw him. On a long late night drive me and this van spent a couple of 100 miles just following each other and occasionally swapping places. When he finally turned off the motorway a few junctions before my own exit, I thought about giving him a goodbye flash of the lights but hesitated in case it was all in my mind. And then he gave a flash of his hazard lights as he went. An insanely old lady walking down the road. Her back was so crooked it looked like she was bent 90 degrees at the waist. She stopped next to her park, pulled out a carton of eggs and started throwing them at the pigeons. I feel that was an essential formative experience for me. I work at a library and a few months ago we were closing up and the supervisor found a man who had no legs in a wheelchair that had fallen asleep in the stacks. She politely woke him up and told him that we were closing in a few minutes and asked if we could call someone for him. He said he didn't have anyone and he basically refused to leave. This was the middle of winter in Iowa so supervisor feels terrible about throwing him out and calls our director and the police to help him find a place to stay. Director shows up and tells the man that we have closed and that the police are on their way. At which point he decides that now he would like to leave. He leaves and wheels himself across the parking lot and out of sight and of course then the police show up. Apparently this guy is basically a missing person and his family has been looking for him for months. The cop circles the neighborhood looking for him but he was gone and he never came back to the library. I just hope that he's okay. I was probably about 8 and in this daycare section of some church when I hit my knee on something. And I said ow because it hurt. And this guy with a mop just stops in the middle of the hallway and stares me dead in the eyes and says in this sadistic Donald Duck voice, "Oh, did you get a boo-boo?" and walks away. It was probably one of the most unsettling things I've experienced. The older gentleman who knocked on my door one day and asked if he could possibly come inside and revisit the home in which he had lived over 55 years ago. It was a pleasure to show him around and to hear his recollection of things that had happened within those walls many years ago, some of which were eye-openers. I never saw him again because he was visiting from the other coast, where he now lives. Still, he told me tales of the house and neighborhood I won't forget. I was in a small town, best known for a dinosaur museum, eating at a restaurant with a friend. This lady who looked to be about in her 80s came over and asked if it was our first time here. My friend shook his head no. I said yes. Then she stared at me and reached into the pocket of her jacket. She slapped a postcard on the table, welcomed me to the town and left. I think I still have that postcard in a drawer somewhere. I was eating at a restaurant seated at a window that looked out onto the main street. I saw an old man walk by after getting off his phone. Hand slowly covering his mouth. Breaking down into tears. He'd obviously heard some bad news. I still think of him and the situation he found himself in. I was sitting in an airport waiting for my flight when I suddenly heard a nearby woman shriek. She was still on her phone. She got up from her seat and was crying and started to run away. The guy she was with ran and grabbed her and said, "What? What?" She said. "My kid's dead." "What? Which one?" "Sarah." And they went off and I had to board my flight. I felt so bad for them and will always wonder what the story was. The cashier at Home Depot who told me to cheer up and how I was too young to look so sad. When I didn't feel in the least bit down and was simply looking around. I have an ugly face, so I've heard this comment more times than I can count. A kind stranger that gave me $2 so I didn't have to lose money by overpaying with a $10 bill to go fishing. My wife and I were outside an entrance to a camp fishing lake that was self-pay. It was $3 but I only had a $1 bill and a $10 bill. A stranger happened to walk up to pay for himself and his friend as I was telling my wife this. And asking her if she had any ones. The stranger just said, "Here you go, man." And handed me $2. The fish that day were not as generous though. Not a single fish was caught. Was walking in Times Square about 15 years ago. A creepy guy was walking next to me for a long time saying super inappropriate things. Out of nowhere an older man came up to me and was like, "Susan, don't walk so fast. Mom and I didn't know where you went." That man saved me and walked me to work. I think about him often. An old guy who was in the hospital bed opposite my dad. He was in a bad way and his wife and daughter were visiting him. Sat for a couple of hours watching them look after him while he was coughing tea up and helping him drink water through a straw from one of those little plastic cups you get in hospital. The daughter who had come up from London was telling them about her kid who was learning about dinosaurs and would talk for ages about them. Didn't speak to them but shared a kind of sad smile with the daughter, who looked pretty distraught by it all. Came to visit the next day and my dad told me he had a heart attack in the middle of the night and was moved to an intensive care ward. Never found out what happened to him. During a family trip to Vegas. My parents took me down to the pool at the Luxor Hotel. I was maybe 7-8 at the time. I met a German girl about my age and we hit it off instantly. Even though we didn't speak the same language. We played together in the pool for what seemed like hours and when it was time to say goodbye we hugged and she said "Ich word dich vermissen" in a very sad voice. I no idea what it meant but I remembered the way it sounded. The one chick who ducked under the crossing guard blockade and leapt across the tracks mere seconds before the train came. She literally threw her entire body in the air into the ground to avoid getting hit. Random girl I sat next to on the subway. We both read our books the whole ride. At her stop she said it was really nice riding with you and left. We hadn't spoken or made eye contact the whole time. You fool. She was the one. This guy with a really cool half man half deer costume at the Ren Fair one year. Aside from the cool costume. He kept playing peekaboo with this little kid and making him scream and giggle. I don't know why he stuck out to me. But he seems like he would have been a cool dude. There were these two guys in front of me in line for the Top Thrill dragster at Cedar Point and I was pretty much freaking the FCK out because I was so scared. They launched the coaster one time and it didn't clear the hill and came back down. Normal thing that sometimes happen, but that scared me shitless. We had already been in line for like 2 hours so I couldn't back out now. The two guys in front of me started cracking jokes and just talking to me about random stuff to get my mind off how scared I was. Then they sat behind me and my friend on the ride and screamed like little girls. They were so awesome. I hope they're still out there cheering people up. I was at a coffee shop waiting for a friend a few years ago. Visibly upset after locking my keys in my car right after getting frustrating news from my doctor. A guy was studying a few tables over. Walked over with a folded piece of paper and passed it to me. Written on it was "Whatever it is, don't worry. Life has a way of sorting itself out," and walked away and left me to it. He later came back with a napkin cause my mascara was running and offered to call AMA for me. Stand up guy. Should have at least asked his name. So thanks cute coffee shop guy with the star tattoos on your arm. You still cross my mind every now and then. Edit. Clarity. AMA equals a tow truck recovery service where I'm from. Random woman who was really nice to me during a very stressful shift. I'm a waiter. Everyone else was being rude and impatient, yet she smiled at me and was understanding. I felt like I was going to go home crying, but that one thing made the whole shift so much more bearable. A few years ago I was on a train outside of Dublin, Ireland, when a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, and her dad sat across from me. She was obviously blind, as she was using a walking stick. After she sat down, she used her stick to feel her surroundings, including my foot, and she made contact. She immediately said, in the most cheerful voice, "Hello there. What's your name?" After introducing myself, she wanted to know more. She asked about the color of my hair, clothes, and bag. She wanted to know where I was from and inquired about my obvious American accent. She asked where I was going, which was Howth, a small coastal town outside of Dublin, and she told me you'll know you're there when you smell the fish. She had such a profound appreciation and curiosity for the world around her, even though she couldn't see any of it. I think about her quite often. The doctor who realized that my lungs were collapsing and began rushing me to ICU. Can't remember his name. His face. Just remember the blue scrubs. He saved my life though. I spent 2 months in the hospital after being in a coma for a week. The 17 cases of what I had before my case had all been fatal. Eosinophilic acute pneumonia. It comes on slowly and is often mistaken for other problems, and it's usually too late. I attended a Tool concert while I was in the midst of going through a divorce. I was in a line to buy beer and a beautiful girl in a parallel beer line kept staring at me. When I caught her gaze, she smiled at me. This happened a couple of times. I was too awkward to go over and talk to her, but it made me feel good about myself at a time when I needed it. Edit. This was in El Paso in 2002. And I am actually glad I didn't approach her, because I am sure I would have ruined the memory. The pizza guy in the little pizza store across the street from my dorm 14 years ago. I was having a bad week and wasn't sure where I was heading in terms of the next few semesters of school and whether I even wanted to stay where I was. I must have had a nasty look on my face when I ordered pizza, because he said half jokingly, "If there's a problem." I replied, "I don't need any more problems." He looked at me. 30 plus years old, wearing a paper cap and apron, working for a hole in the wall third-rate pizza shop. "You want to switch problems? Is that what you're telling me?" I simultaneously cheered up and got more depressed at the same time. This girl in Central Park, who started to talk to me because I was a tourist, and wished me a good life when we said goodbye. I was at rock bottom. I felt so alone. Drunkenly making my way home one night. The "everything is okay" mask was too heavy to keep on. I must have looked pretty desperate. A gang of rowdy lads was storming past me, probably making their way to some party. A tall, aggressive looking guy at the back of the group glanced at me as he was passing. I was following him with my eyes as he passed, since I half expected him to attack. He took a few steps, stopped, then swung around to me. I thought I was about to get the shit kicked out of me, but he just stepped over to me, looked me straight in the eyes, put a hand to my face and said a few kind words. I'll never forget that gesture. Not just because it was unexpected. I felt like someone cared. Even if it was just a stranger. If you're feeling low, just remember someone cares about you. 2. Even if it's just a stranger you haven't met yet. Borrowing from you Reverse Waterfalls post. It's really nice riding with you. Driving home one day after school on a country-ish road. About to pass a car I've never seen before. Being driven by someone I've never seen before. Dude flips me off. Vigorously. Was driving the speed limit and 100% in my lane. Blew my 17-year-old mind. Still does. What a dick. This woman I saw at the bookstore cafe dipping a lollipop into coffee or some hot drink and sharing it with her kids. Edit. It was a big fat round ass lemon lollipop, not honey. Edit 2. Yes, this is strange. I was working the register at a gas station when a girl came up and gave me her number on the back of a receipt. The confidence she had to do that in front of the other customers and with a smile too has had me thinking about her for months. When I was a kid, I was walking around with my mom at a Shopko or Kmart, I don't remember which currently, and I was looking around when I saw this older guy. I stared at him the way kids do. When he looks at me sideways and gives me a wink. It immediately intrigued me and I kept staring at him wondering why he would randomly wink at me. Although I'm sure he did it just to mess with me the way silly dad type guys like to do. But to this day I still wink randomly at kids just because I remember that one incident and it had a really weird, good impact on me. I once saw an older woman eating an entire bowl of guacamole as her entree at a Mexican restaurant. It was, to be honest, very jealousy inducing. As a 10-year-old boy of mixed Asian European race living in Australia, I was jogging around a lake for fitness. Jogging the opposite way was a stocky African American man, who when we crossed paths, said to me in a deep American accent, "Mornin' brother." Apostrophe. As a kid who idolized America, it was amazing to be recognized as a brother. I was in Bergen with a friend doing a tour around Norway. We were in a park and this guy, curly hair, around 40 years old, smiled at us. The happiest, nicest, beautifulest smile of all. He walked away, and we turned to look at him. He was looking at us too, and waved at us. I like to imagine he is still smiling at people in this park and being happy. He was definitely trying to act normal while tripping balls. I went to an air show a few years ago when a plane crashed and a woman was on the wing. She and the pilot were instantly killed and I had the perfect view. My friends and I went to a diner a few miles down the road, silently sipping our drinks. Nobody spoke. And it all just hit me at once and I broke down into gasping sobs. I tried to stop but couldn't. A little girl, maybe 5, was in line with her mom and she walked up to me, put her tiny hand on my knee and just sorta stood there acknowledging my current state. And for some reason my breathing got smoother and I calmed down enough to look at her and say thank you. She just walked away, happy as a clam. And then they left. I still think about her. This was a few years ago and I can't remember the details. But I was carrying something with both my hands and this one guy must have noticed it because he stood by the door to which I was heading. It was the only way out of the place we were at, even though he could have just walked away because the gap between us was quite huge. But he stayed and held the door for me. On top of that, he gave me the most genuine smile I've ever received as I passed the door and thanked him. I was run over when I was about 8. It was completely my fault. 100%. I'd love to somehow speak to the woman who was unfortunately the one whose car I ran in front of. I got straight back up, miraculously, and gave her a feeble thumbs up and ran away. If that was me now it would have traumatized me for life. She has no way, considering this was about 1996, to know that I was completely okay. I think about her almost every time I cross a road.